Section 15 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Milestone 9, Part 1. 1885 to 1886. As time kept whispering its hastening call into my ear, I grew more and more vigorous in my outlook. I was given strength to hurry faster myself, with a certain energy to climb higher up, where the view was wider, bigger, clearer. As I moved upward I had but one fear, and that was of looking backward. A minister, entrusted with the charge of souls, cannot afford to retrace his steps. He must go on and up, to the top of his abilities, of his spiritual purposes. In the midst of a glorious summer, I refused to see the long shadows of departing day. In the midst of a snow-deep winter, I declined to slip and slide as I went on. So it happened that a great many gathered about me in the tabernacle because they felt I was passing on, and they wanted to see how fast I could go. I aimed always for a higher place and the way to get up to it, and I took them along with me, always a little further, week by week. The pessimists came to me and said that the world would soon have a surplus of educated men, that the colleges were turning out many nerveless and useless youngsters, that education seemed to be one of the follies of 1885. The fact was we were getting to be far superior to what we had been. The speeches at the commencement classes were much better than those we had made in our boyhood. We had dropped the old harangues about Greece and Rome. We were talking about the present. The sylphs and naiads and dryads had already gone out of business. College education had been revolutionized. Students were not stuffed to the Adam's apple with Latin and Greek. The graduates were improved in physique. A great advance was reached when male and female students were placed in the same institutions side by side. God put the two sexes together in Eden. He put them beside each other in the family. Why not in the college? There were those who seemed to regard woman as a divine afterthought. Judging by the fashion plates of olden times, in other centuries, the granddaughters were far superior to the grandmothers, and the fuss they used to make 100 years ago over a very good woman showed me that the feminine excellence, so rare then, was more common than it used to be. At the beginning of the 19th century a woman was considered well educated if she could do a sum in rule of 3. Look at the books in all the departments that are under the arms of the schoolmiss now. I believe in equal education for men and women to fulfill the destiny of this land. For all women who were then entering the battle of life, I saw that the time was coming when they would not only get as much salary as men, but for certain employments they would receive higher wages. It would not come to them through the spirit of gallantry, but through the woman's finer natural taste, greater grace of manner, and keener perceptions. For these virtues she would be worth 10 per cent more to her employer than a man. But she would get it by earning it, not by asking for it. In the summer of 1885 I made another trip to Europe. The day I reached Charing Cross Station in London, the exposures of vice in the Pall Mall Gazette were just issued. The paper had not been out half an hour. Mr. Stead, the editor, was later put on trial for startling Europe and America in his crusade against crime. There were the same conditions in America, in Upper Broadway, and in other big thoroughfares in New York by night as there were in London. I believe the greatest safety against vice is newspaper chastisement of dishonor and crime. I urged that some paper in America should attack the social evil, as the Pall Mall Gazette had done. 100,000 people, with banners and music, gathered in Hyde Park in London to express their approval of the reformation started by Mr. Stead, and there were 1,000,000 people in America who would have backed up the same moral heroism. If my voice were loud enough to be heard from Penobscot to the Rio Grande, I would cry out, "Flirtation is damnation." The vast majority of those who make everlasting shipwreck carry that kind of sail. The pirates of death attack that kind of craft. My mail bag was a mirror that reflected all sides of the world, and much that it showed me was pitifully sordid and reckless. Most of the letters I answered, others I destroyed. The following one I saved, for obvious reasons. It was signed "One of the Congregation." Dear Sir, I do not believe much that you preach, but I am certain that you believe it all. To be a Christian I must believe the Bible. To be truthful, I do not believe it. I go to hear you preach because you preach the Bible as I was taught it in my youth, by a father who, like yourself, believed what in the capacity of a preacher he proclaimed. For 35 years I have been anxious to walk in the path my mother is treading, a simple faith. I have lived to see my children's children, and the distance that lies between me and my real estate in the graveyard cannot be very great. At my age it would be worse than folly to argue, simply to confound or dispute, merely for the love of arguing. My steps are already tottering, and I am lost in the wilderness. I pray because I am afraid not to pray. What can I do that I have not done, so that I can see clearly? All my sympathies were excited by this letter, because I had been in that quagmire myself. A student of Dr. Witherspoon once came to him and said, "I believe everything is imaginary. I myself am only an imaginary being." The doctor said to him, "Go down and hit your head against the college door. And if you are imaginary and the door imaginary, it won't hurt you." A celebrated theological professor at Princeton was asked this by a skeptic. "You say, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. How do you account for the fact that your son is such a dissipated fellow?" The doctor replied, "The promise is that when he is old he will not depart from it. My son is not old enough yet." He grew old and his faith returned. The Reverend Dr. Hall made the statement that he discovered in the biographies of 100 clergymen that they all had sons who were clergymen, all piously inclined. There is no safe way to discuss religion, save from the heart. It evaporates when you dare to analyze its sacred element. I received multitudes of letters written by anxious parents about sons who had just come to the city. Letters without end, asking aid for worthy individuals and institutions, which I could not meet even if I had an income of $500,000 per annum. Letters from men who told me that unless I sent them $25 by return mail, they would jump into the East River. Letters from people 1,000 miles away, saying if they couldn't raise $1,500 to pay off a mortgage, they would be sold out, and wouldn't I send it to them? Letters of good advice, telling me how to preach, and the poorer the syntax and the etymology, the more insistent the command. Many encouraging letters were a great help to me. Some letters of a spiritual beauty and power were magnificent tokens of a preacher's work. Most of these letters were lacking in one thing, Christian confidence, and yet what noble examples there were of this quality in the world. What an example was exhibited to all when, on October 8, 1885, the organ at Westminster Abbey uttered its deep notes of mourning at the funeral of Lord Shaftesbury in England. It is well to remember such a nobleman as he was. The chair at Exeter Hall, where he so often presided, should be always associated with him. His last public act, at 84 years of age, was to go forth in great feebleness and make an earnest protest against the infamies exposed by Mr. Stead in London. In that dying speech he called upon Parliament to defend the purity of the city. As far back as 1840 his voice in Parliament rang out against the oppression of factory workers, and he succeeded in securing better legislation for them. He worked and contributed for the ragged schools of England, by which over 200,000 poor children of London were redeemed. He was president of Bible and missionary societies, and was for 30 years president of the Young Men's Christian Association. I never forgave Lord Macaulay for saying he hoped that the praying of Exeter Hall would soon come to an end. On his 80th birthday a holiday was declared in honour of Lord Shaftesbury, and vast multitudes kept it. From the Lord Mayor himself to the girls of the Watercress and Flower Mission, all offered him their congratulations. Alfred Tennyson, the poet laureate, wrote him, "Allow me to assure you in plain prose how cordially I join with those who honour the Earl of Shaftesbury as a friend of the poor." And how modest was the Earl's reply. He said, "You have heard that which has been said in my honour. Let me remark with the deepest sincerity, ascribe it not, I beseech you, to cant and hypocrisy, that if these statements are partially true, it must be because power has been given me from above. It was not in me to do these things." How constantly through my life have I heard the same testimony of the power that answers prayer. I believed it, and I said it repeatedly, that the reason American politics has become the most corrupt element of our nation was because we had ignored the power of prayer. History everywhere confesses its force. The Huguenots took possession of the Carolinas in the name of God. William Penn settled Pennsylvania in the name of God. The Pilgrim Fathers settled New England in the name of God. Preceding the first gun of Bunker Hill, at the voice of prayer, all heads uncovered. In the War of 1812 an officer came to General Andrew Jackson and said, "There is an unusual noise in the camp, it ought to be stopped." The general asked what this noise was. He was told it was the voice of prayer. "God forbid that prayer and praise should be an unusual noise in the camp," said General Jackson. "You had better go and join them." There was prayer at Valley Forge, at Monmouth, at Atlanta, at South Mountain, at Gettysburg. But the infamy of politics was broad and wide and universal. Even the record of Andrew Johnson, our 17th president, was exhumed. He was charged with conspiracy against the United States government. Because he came from a border state where loyalty was more difficult than in the northern states, he was accused of making a nefarious attack against our government. I did not accept these charges. They were freighted with political purpose. I said then, in order to prove General Grant a good man, it was not necessary to try and prove that Johnson was a bad one. The President from Tennessee left no sons to vindicate his name. I never saw President Johnson but once, but I refuse to believe these attacks upon him. They were an unwarranted persecution of the sacred memory of the dead. No man who has been eminently useful has escaped being eminently cursed. At our local elections in Brooklyn, in the autumn of 1885, 3 candidates for mayor were nominated. They were all exceptionally good men. 2 of them were personal friends of mine, General Catlin and Dr. Funk. Catlin had twice been brevetted for gallantry in the Civil War, and Dr. Funk was on the Prohibition ticket, because he had represented Prohibition all his life. Mr. Woodward, the 3rd candidate, I did not know, but he was a strict Methodist, and that was recommendation enough. But there were pleasanter matters to think about than politics. In November of this year there appeared at the Horticultural Hall in New York a wonderful floral stranger from China, the chrysanthemum. Thousands of people paid to go and see these constellations of beauty. It was a new plant to us then, and we went mad about it in true American fashion. To walk among these flowers was like crossing a corner of heaven. It became a mania of the times, almost like the tulip mania of Holland in the 17th century. People who had voted that the Chinese must go, voted that the Chinese chrysanthemum could stay. The rose was forgotten for the time being, and the violets and the carnations and the lily of the valley. In America we were still the children of the world, delighted with everything that was new and beautiful. In Europe the war dance of nations continued. In the 22 years preceding the year 1820, Christendom had paid $10 billions for battles. The exorbitant taxes of Great Britain and the United States were results of war. There was a great wave of gospel effort in America to counteract the European war fever. It permeated the legislature in Albany. One morning some members of the New York legislature inaugurated a prayer meeting in the room of the Court of Appeals, and at that meeting, which began with 6 people, at the 5th session overflowed the room. Think of a gospel revival in the Albany legislature! Yet why not just such meetings in all state capitals, in this land of the Pilgrim Fathers, of the Huguenots, of the Dutch reformers, of the Hungarian exiles? Section 16